Any of you ever seen a little getaway network on TV that seems to be growing in popularity called Nick at Nite? Anybody watch that? Nick at Nite is a network that basically appeals to anyone who likes, among other things, vintage sitcoms. And it's getting a growing audience, I found out last night, among 5 and 10-year-olds. They love to know what their parents were like before they came along. If you are a night owl and you can't get enough of Mary Tyler Moore, or the Jeffersons, or Rhoda, or until recently, the Cosby Show, but I'm not going into that, you can troll around Nick at Nite and find your old friends that you grew up with. Shows like Full House, Family Matters, or The Nanny. Shows that harken back to a time when publicly acceptable storytelling was perhaps a little younger and maybe a little more innocent. You might run into women with big hair, and you might run into a lot of people wearing shoulder pads. Watching these old shows is a fascinating study of how pop culture then only hinted at things that television boldly tells us and shows us now. Like old television shows, Nicodemus was a Jew who hearkened back to an earlier time. Nicodemus was part of the Sanhedrin. Now, the Sanhedrin were people in every Jewish community, priests or sages or attorneys, who governed the local and even the larger Jewish community. If you belong to the great Sanhedrin, you governed the larger Jewish community. And the reason that the Pharisees belonged to the Sanhedrin and governed the Jewish community was because they knew the law. The Sanhedrin knew the books of Moses, and they also knew the Mishnah and the traditions of the people. But this unusual Jew, this Jesus, intrigued the Pharisee Nicodemus in such a way that he could not get Jesus out of his head. Who had ever had healing power like Jesus? Who could ever bring people back to life like Jesus? Who knew the law of Moses even better than the Sanhedrin? Jesus. Later, Nicodemus would suggest and caution the Sanhedrin council to give ear to Jesus and to regard Jesus with more respect. After Jesus' death, Nicodemus showed up with spices and perhaps the same kind of myrrh that the wise men brought to the young Jesus. The same kind of burial spices to anoint Jesus' body. But this passage read in our hearing today by Annette is the result of a clandestine meeting between only Nicodemus and Jesus. You see, Nicodemus was fascinated by Jesus, but he knew enough not to come to Jesus by day and risk the displeasure and censure of his colleagues, his fellow Pharisees, who sat on the Sanhedrin council. So Nicodemus, or Nick, as his friends might call him, stole away from his friends and came to Jesus by night. Nick at night. As Nicodemus approached Jesus, he was very aware that he was approaching great power. He approaches Jesus with huge respect. He says, Rabboni, or Rabbi, the most respected Aramaic word for teacher. We know that you have come from God. We know that you have come from God because no one could perform the signs and miracles that you do apart from the presence of God. Jesus agrees with him. He, in essence, says, you're right, Nick. No one can see the kingdom of God without being born from above. Born from above. But then the lawyer Nicodemus becomes defensive. You know how we all do when we know what we know? He says, I know what I know, Jesus. Look at me, Jesus. How can anybody be reborn after growing old, Jesus? Must I enter into my mother's womb, my mother, who is probably long gone, and be born a second time? What are you talking about, Jesus? And Jesus looks at him and says, the same way that Jesus said to the rich young rulers in the Gospel of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Nicodemus, in order to understand me, you have to disbelieve and question everything that you think you know. You must be reborn of the water, and not only of the water, but of the Spirit.